Well, Ian Ground, it is good to see you.
Hi
Uh,
Dan, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Welcome to Sophia, which is the name that we've given the show that we've been doing, Massimo Pigliucci and I. Um,
Sure.
we always start with introductions, Ian, so why don't you introduce yourself and then I'll do the same and we can get started.
Okay, well, my name's Ian Ground. I live in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. It's the northeast of England. I'm currently working at Newcastle University, where I'm teaching philosophy to fine arts students at the moment, which I'm enjoying a lot. And I act as secretary of the British Wittgenstein Society, so I'm involved in a lot of Wittgenstein-related activities. My kind of background, really, I have a long history of involvement in adult and community education, which I'm very proud of. And research-wise, my main interests have been historically been in the philosophy of art and aesthetics, and in Wittgenstein, of course, and in particular in relation to philosophical problems concerning our understanding of other kinds of animal. So, animal cognition, animal minds is a big interest of mine. I think it's a kind of area where there's a lot of kind of action, a lot of interesting issues that cross over there. Maybe that will come up in some of our discussions today. So that's me. Yeah.
Great. So I'm Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. I've known Ian for a long time. We go back to, for a number of years, I was giving papers at the annual meeting of the British Society of Aesthetics, with
Yeah.
which Ian was very much involved. And so he and I developed quite a friendship. And I'm really pleased that he's able to be here with me today to talk about Wittgenstein, something that I've been promising viewers that I was gonna get to at some point, but I knew I wanted Ian for it, and so we had to wait until our schedules synced. The occasion, Ian, of doing this in part was due to the fact that you recently gave what I thought was really an outstanding paper to the Royal Institute of Philosophy, um, called "Why Wittgenstein Matters,"
Yeah.
and that there will be a link provided on the link section to the talk, which is on YouTube, which I'm going to strongly recommend that people watch. It gives a very good sort of introduction to Wittgenstein, and I sort of figured I'd pattern our discussion a little bit along the topics that you asked there, that you covered there.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah. Good.
so let's start. Maybe maybe you could give me a little bit of your assessment of what is Wittgenstein's current place in academic philosophy, um, and maybe a couple of some of the reasons why you think that's his current status.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a good and interesting question, Dan. That should be clear, I guess, that we mean by academic philosophy here kind of Anglo-American philosophy, basically. Okay, so Anglo-American, largely analytic philosophy. I think Wittgenstein's position there is a deeply ambivalent one. In fact, um, on the one hand, if you ask almost any philosopher to name any of the great philosophers of the last century, or indeed of any century, Wittgenstein's name will surely crop up in their top five, or even their top three most influential philosophers. Then, if you ask them, well, just in what respect does Wittgenstein influence your work? Uh, the likelihood is they'll be unable to answer that.
Because
They
he
will have
does it, right?
to so on the one hand, Wittgenstein is thought of as being enormously important and influential. On the other hand, in terms of how philosophy is done, in terms of how it's the practice is carried out, there's very, at the moment, it seems, and has been, I guess, for the last 5 to 10 years, certainly very little tangible evidence of that in what we're calling mainstream philosophy. Of course, study of Wittgenstein goes on amongst people who are interested in Wittgenstein, but that's a different matter. Okay, so Wittgenstein's position is one of authority without influence at the moment. Okay, and this seems to me a very peculiar state of affairs, especially if you contrast the situation, contrast the regard for Wittgenstein, the interest in Wittgenstein from outside philosophy, from outside mainstream philosophy, certainly in the culture at large, in the arts. There's an enormous interest in the man and his ideas, but that isn't reflected in the mainstream itself. Okay, there's a whole kind of host of reasons why that's the case. Some of those I think got to do with how Wittgenstein did philosophy. Okay, what his approach to doing philosophy was. And a second set of reasons that are kind of related, they're not separate, but they're distinguishable, I think, are to do with what he had to say and how that relates to what mainstream philosophy thinks it's important to say today. Okay, I mean, insofar as mainstream philosophy speaks with any kind of single voice, which is, obviously there are diverse voices within mainstream philosophy,
right?
But looking at a whole, so the situation is a kind of paradoxical one then. So we can talk about how that works.
Yeah.
So
before you give me a little account of the two types of reasons that you think Wittgenstein has sort of lost influence, just to give the audience a rough sense of the history, when would you say was the peak of Wittgenstein's influence in the analytic tradition, and maybe 30 seconds on in what way that influence was felt? I mean, there was a movement in the mid 20th century called ordinary language philosophy, which he clearly had an influence on. But how do you see the history? When was his heyday, and what influence did he primarily have before he sort of fell out of favor?
I suppose that the kind of heyday was in the kind of 60s through to the early to mid 80s, I suppose. Yeah, so I think so. Certainly, he had a massive influence on what you'd call kind of ordinary language philosophy. It's very moot, okay, whether or not those people who called themselves ordinary language philosophers got Wittgenstein right. Okay, it's very moot indeed whether that's the case. Okay, just as earlier in the century, the logical positivists had claimed Wittgenstein as one of their own and were wrong.
Right.
I'd also argue that ordinary language philosophers kind of picked up on just some aspects of Wittgenstein and ran with those. And this was a very partial picture of what his ideas were about.
Right.
Okay? So throughout the 60s, it became, in a way, a rather unhealthy situation eventually, because I think that the interpretations of Wittgenstein that were offered them were often really quite formulaic. Okay? There are a host of books called The Language of something or other,
right,
which had a very kind of similar motivation, a similar kind of way of solving or dissolving philosophical problems. And I think that the situation now is just as I think we've begun really to get a deeper insight into why Wittgenstein's ideas really matter. Okay? That his influence has waned. That may not be coincidental.
When we had him wrong, he was really important, right?
Yeah.
Now that we're starting to figure out what it really is.
But this situation is not dissimilar to that which followed other great thinkers. If one thinks of, the post-Kantians, for example, we're in a very similar situation. It wasn't until much later, I think, that we really began to understand Kant.
Yeah.
So this is not to be unexpected when one's dealing with a figure of this stature.
So why don't you now talk a little bit about the two sorts of reasons why you think Wittgenstein is difficult for analytic philosophers to digest and or distasteful to said philosophers.
Yeah.
You mentioned both the way he goes about doing his work and also the substance of it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about each of those.
I should probably first say, Dan, that let's just for now just talk about the Wittgenstein of the philosophical
That's
investigations.
all we're going to talk about
Okay,
today. Yeah, the later
so
Wittgenstein.
what's commonly known as the later Wittgenstein, lots of controversy about that. Let's not go there with that for now for this talk. Okay, so if we look at his masterpiece, which is the Philosophical Investigations, which has recently come out in a new translation and edition with some interesting changes and Uncertainty, the book that follows that, and so forth. Look at that group of work, that amount of work. I mean, what's one thing that's very striking about this is that, as is familiar to anyone who's come across it at all, if you haven't, I urge people to just to have a look at the investigations, start reading it, is that one doesn't get straightforward statements of an argument with premises and conclusions and claims being laid out and nicely bulleted and so forth. Okay, it simply doesn't work like that. What we have is a kind of drama really going on in this text, in which all sorts of different kinds of voices come and go, all sorts of protagonists are there. Putting forward different positions, offering different slants, and there seem to be very many kind of abrupt changes of topic. So we go from one numbered remark, and remarks are numbered. Some are very short, just one sentence. Some are a page length. Okay. We see very abrupt changes of topic. We see sudden starts, sudden stops. Sometimes there will be an extended discussion of example, sometimes a series of short examples. And so, and the method is one also of engaging the reader.
Yeah, he asks you questions.
Asking questions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think someone counted this once that in the investigations, he asked 784 questions.
Jesus.
And of those, only 110 are actually answered.
And how many of those are the answers intended to be correct?
Well, only 70 of those, the answers need to be wrong. So it's only a tiny fraction where he asks the question and gives us the answer. And of course, this is meant to engage us in the process of thinking for ourselves with him. So it's a really very intense experience to read the investigations if you read it. I think it should be read. Okay. And so it's not easy in that case then to just read the investigations or to study as I have done for many decades, and then to say, well, okay, what did I learn from that? Okay, and just to kind of summarize what you got out of it. Okay, in some ways, rather like dealing with or experiencing a work of art. Okay? It's not very easy to kind of paraphrase afterwards what the upshot of all that was. So it's quite it's an intense experience to read the investigations. It's in many ways, I think, and indeed, even Dan Dennett says, of all people, it's a liberating experience. Okay, to read the investigations.
It doesn't seem to have liberated him all that much, though.
He certainly used some insights from Wittgenstein in the right place. Okay? And so it's very hard then for mainstream philosophers just to say, well, okay, I can use that in the that idea makes sense in the project that I'm engaged in now. What's interesting me now, okay? And of course, as it happens, when mainstream philosophers, as they occasionally do, of course, reference Wittgenstein, one problem is that they'll come up with a particular view about what Wittgenstein has said there, and then a danger is that someone else will say, from a more Wittgensteinian perspective, oh, you haven't got Wittgenstein right there. What you mean is what he actually says is, and they say, well, okay, you tell me what he really means. And the Wittgensteinian scholar says, well, it could be this or it could be that. Well, hey, I just want to use one of the ideas, says the mainstream philosopher. I just leave it alone. It's too toxic, okay, for me to use. It's too hot, okay. And so, for that reason, the investigations is a difficult book to use to kind of take bits from, okay.
Right.
And the danger is, I think, it's perceived at least as being a book where you have to take all of it, okay, or nothing. And that obviously makes life difficult for the mainstream philosopher. Okay, so that's one kind of reason. I suppose the second sort of reason now, if we want to move on to that, is about what Wittgenstein says about the content. Okay, and of course, I should say, by way of a precursor to this, that these two issues are linked because part of Wittgenstein's method is to be, and also what he says, is to be very skeptical about the nature of philosophical theories and claims. Okay. That he doesn't think that philosophers are in the business of making claims in the way that the empirical scientist does. So, so part of what he wants to say is an anti-philosophical message. Okay, and this is part and parcel of the methods why we don't get very straightforward, clearly laid out claims in the same way as one might find in other philosophers. One finds this anti-philosophical message, which again will go down rather badly with the mainstream philosopher. After all, but mainstream philosophers have to live with real academic jobs and seek tenure and show their impact to their funders and so forth. And the impression that they can form of Wittgenstein is that he's saying that really the problems that are caused, that the problems that exercise us in philosophy are really just kind of pseudo problems.
So let me ask. Okay, so on that front, so let me ask you. That certainly makes a lot of sense, and no, especially today in the professionalized academy, and philosophy was professionalized in Wittgenstein's day, but not to the extent that it is now. And the academy wasn't the way it is now, and the humanities weren't under the kind of pressure then that they are now.
Yeah.
And so all of those things are not going to be very friendly. Those factors are not going to make people very friendly towards an anti-philosophical philosophy. But let me just ask you on the substance of it. One could say very much similar things about the philosophy of David Hume, that David Hume was extraordinarily skeptical about exactly the sorts of things that philosophers were doing.
Yeah.
And yet Hume is a darling of the analytic philosophy community today.
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein is that. Without going into too much detail, could you maybe say a word or two about how you see the philosophy of Wittgenstein as maybe being worse than Hume's, or having why the disconnect? Why do they love Hume so much and hate and not like Wittgenstein when they had similar? The conclusions they come to have similar impact on what philosophers do.
It's a good point there. I mean, it's not just Hume, isn't it, who's anti-philosophical. If you think, and there's a sense in which Kant too. Kant was arguing against the philosophy of his time, arguing against a certain kind of metaphysics, right? And one can find it too, in philosophers like Nietzsche, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So many great philosophers. Okay. Part of what they wanted to say was that there was something very deeply wrong with the philosophy of their times. Okay? And not just with a particular kind of claim being made, a particular set of philosophical claims, but with how philosophy conceived itself. Okay? And these two things always run together. Okay? Now, why is it that people are alienated, or so it seems, by this kind of anti-philosophical thought in Wittgenstein, but not in Hume? Well, partly I think Wittgenstein is certainly at places, very forthright about it. Okay, so he certainly in the remarks around the early hundreds, in the investigations, we get some very forthright messages about philosophy, and moreover, he compares philosophy to a kind of illness, a kind of sickness,
right?
And as what he's doing as being a kind of therapy or a kind of cure. Of course, it's not any kind of psychoanalytic cure in that sense. Okay, right. It is it is a kind of an attempt to get us to think much more deeply about not just about what we think, but about how we think about such matters. Okay?
Right.
And this is quite threatening now. And I think unlike, I think, one difference with between Wittgenstein and Hume here, though one can exaggerate even this difference, is that Wittgenstein tries to be much more forensic, okay, in examining the sources of why we go wrong. Okay?
That's good. I like that. Yeah.
Tracing. With Hume, we get claims and assertions. Okay, we get some diagnosis, but not so much. Whereas in Wittgenstein, really, you could say almost the whole of the investigations is about diagnosing in great detail and with enormous and ruthless kind of self honesty and criticism here, okay? Because it's his own thinking that he's criticizing at the same time, not anybody else's. He hardly mentions other philosophers in investigations. Himself, Frege, James, well, that's about it, more or less.
St. Augustine in the first quote.
St. Augustine, and even then, not as a philosopher, but as someone writing his own biography. So his anti-philosophy is much more kind of overt. Okay? But I think one ought to get that in context now. Ironically, many of the things, in fact, that Wittgenstein is saying when he's diagnosing the sources of these problems line up rather well with the claims made by cognitive scientists today about the sources of error in our own thinking. One of the common claims today is that we are still very likely to go wrong in our thinking in systematic ways. Okay? Even when we think we're our most clear-headed and rational.
Right.
Even when we think we're being as objective and rational as we can, but we still go really wrong. I mean, as the old joke has it, everywhere you look these days, you see confirmation bias. So Wittgenstein is offering this kind of forensic diagnosis. But it's important to remember of our thinking, but it's important to remember that he's not here, at some level, he's criticizing much more than just philosophy and philosophers. He says that the pictures, and he thinks them here, he uses the term for pictures, which kind of mislead us. So it says they lie in our language. It doesn't say they lie just in philosophy.
Right.
They lie in our language. It says language seems to repeat those pictures to us inexorably. Okay? We are, as we're held captive by them. But of course, for Wittgenstein, language is not some kind of formalized set of symbols or system. Okay? It's our way of life.
Yeah.
Okay? He says that to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. So this means that the ways in which we go wrong arise as soon as we begin to reflect upon what we actually do.
Yeah, okay? And in that sense, he's that's a very clear sense also in which he's different from Hume, because for Hume is really interested in how we go wrong when we engage in philosophical investigation, and for Wittgenstein, it's more general than that. It's whenever we engage in a certain kind of reflection upon our practices. So
that's right.
And so it's got a much bigger scope. So maybe it's a great point at which for you to get into the specifics of Wittgenstein's critique, into the orientation of Wittgenstein's critique, which you in your talk characterize as fundamentally a critique of what you call representationalism. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what representationalism is, as you understand Wittgenstein understanding it, and also the way in which representationalism manifests itself in ordinary thinking, as well as obviously in philosophical reflection.
Okay, so I think this has kind of been the kind of dominant representationalism of one kind or another has been the kind of dominant paradigm in philosophy for a very long time now, and it's been absolutely central since the 60s. I mean, the cognitive revolution is actually built on it. But let's go back a bit and see.
It starts in the Enlightenment, wouldn't you say? It starts in the Enlightenment.
I think it goes a long way back, but one sees it. It's made explicitly as a kind of doctrine. Of course, Wittgenstein himself did the most to develop this in his earlier book, The Tractatus.
Right.
Okay, but let's try and think about how it arises from our ordinary thinking. Okay,
what is it?
Yeah. So. I mean, if I talk to people who have no experience of philosophy at all, and they say, "Well, what's Wittgenstein about? Isn't he about language?" What they have in mind is that Wittgenstein is saying that language is a kind of social activity. Okay, so Wittgenstein thinks of language as a social activity, and they kind of get that. They go, "Yeah, that makes sense," but no, that seems got to be right. Okay, we use language to communicate, don't we? Okay. But isn't that kind of obvious, right? Isn't that, know that already? What's so great about that idea? And of course, we use language to talk to each other. Okay, and I would say, yeah, you're right. Okay, Wittgenstein it does take the view that language is a social and public activity, but it is so. And here's the thing: all the way down, right? All the way down. What do I mean by that? Well, if we say, well, what do we say? Language is a social activity. What people have in mind is something like this: that language is used to communicate our ideas, okay, to communicate our thoughts and our feelings. Okay, but first of all, we have to have something to communicate.
We have to have ideas, thoughts, and
We have to
feelings.
have ideas first of all.
Right.
Okay, and so prior to expressing them or describing them in language, I must already have them. And so I have a thought, okay, that it's raining outside. Take a trivial example. It usually is here these days. And then I can choose whether or not to tell my good friend Dan Kaufman about the weather in England. Okay, but the question is, well, what about the thought, right? What about the thought or the idea, okay, that it's raining outside, the weather is terrible outside? Okay. Well, that can't be a matter of the thought is a matter of kind of public and social activity, right? That's got to be something unique and private to the individual. It comes first. Okay? So first come ideas, okay, thoughts about the world, and after that we communicate them. Now, what are those ideas prior to language? What are those thoughts? Well, one generic term to describe those is the term representations. Okay? So at first I represent the world to myself.
Right.
I represent how things are, and then I may or may not tell other people about them.
Right. Okay?
Now we say, well, that's interesting. Okay, that's how things are then. So we're social on the outside, but on the inside we're representational.
Gotcha.
That's the thought. Okay. Now, how does that get going? Well, that view has become the kind of dominant view of what the mind is, really. So for many cognitive scientists, for example, okay, what the so-called cognitive revolution was about was the explicit realization, as they saw it, that the mind is a representational engine. Okay, that the business of the mind is to represent the world and to manipulate those representations internally. So the picture that we have of the mind is that external stimuli come in through perception, okay, that this gives rise to representations of how the world is, okay, that the mind manipulates these representations, okay, and produces some kind of response, okay, which is appropriate to the environment we're in.
Okay? And then, so the main challenge then for the scientist is to give some account, either neurochemical or computational, depending on your orientation, of what those representations are and how they causally interact with each other.
Exactly. So how those representations work in virtue of what are they representations, okay, and what's their nature? What kind of thing are they? Okay, let's notice one thing right away. Okay, that they can't just be internal sentences for me in English.
Because part of what we're trying to understand is
Right.
English.
Trying to understand, if we're trying to understand how I can communicate anything in language, I can't just say, well, that's just an internal language, which is exactly like English. It will be completely non-explanatory.
Right.
Indeed, Wittgenstein makes this move very early on. It turns out to be a move that, in its shape, repeats throughout the investigations, when he points out that we really mustn't try and understand what it is to speak, to learn a language, as if we were explaining what it is to learn a second language, right? So the problem of explaining how on earth anything in English means anything, okay, is a different kind of question from how it is, given that I speak English, I can translate something into French.
Right.
Okay, because we're talking about how meaning gets going at all.
Right.
Okay? So the mainstream view has been, well, what's the nature of this representation? But they kind of realize that. Okay, it can't just be English. That would be circular. Okay, so maybe it's some kind of a neuralese,
Right. Mentalese, it's sometimes called.
mentalese,
Right.
okay, or below that neuralese, okay, something which has the same sort of structure at some fundamental level as language has, okay, but isn't language.
It's
Right?
really
So this
quite
is
an extraordinary. Actually, if you step
it's
outside and think about it, it's actually quite an extraordinary idea. So the idea is that
yeah,
the sentence that it's raining in English is preceded by some
yeah.
mental sentence, which is not in English, that says it's raining, and somehow that's a bunch of chemicals
Well,
that are arranged. What, like the words? I mean,
well, there's going to be some kind of fact, okay? There's got to be some kind of fact in the end, which is the representation of the fact that it's raining outside. Okay, this is a bit of a weird idea because here's the fact I'm representing. It's raining, and here's the fact doing the representing. Okay, well, how is it that this fact represents that one?
right.
Because we need some kind of arrow. Because we're not going to say, okay, that the weather is the representation of the relevant state of my brain. It doesn't work that way. There's a kind of asymmetry involved in representation. This is something that other philosophers have pointed out. Okay, it's the kind of move actually that's there in people who've taken much from Wittgenstein, like Putnam, for example, and indeed John Searle. It's also a problem that became known in AI circles, artificial intelligence circles, as the symbol grounding problem.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that is, how could the states of a computer, which are, after all, in the end, just voltages, how could they actually symbolize anything?
Right. So let's just because we're talking to a lay audience, so let's just
Yeah,
unpack this a little bit. So the
sure.
problem here kind of is whether something can be representational intrinsically, right? Because
Yeah,
some things are. So I could draw a picture of a rainy day, and
yeah.
it would represent the fact that it would represent that fact by virtue of looking like it, right?
Well, yeah, okay.
I'm trying to
But
be
if you,
simple here, right?
yeah, that's fine.
But I
Okay,
guess
yeah,
the
you should.
puzzle then is, how does a sentence do that, right?
Yeah,
I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, it does that by way of some sort of convention, by way of some sort of agreement. We all agree that these string of symbols means this,
yeah,
and
yeah,
this string of symbols mean that. But then, of course, the question is, in order to have that convention, we already have to be talking to each other,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so it can't be that all meaning is a matter of convention, right?
Mhm.
Because at some point, you're going to have to get something to get it going.
That's
And
right.
so that then tempts us to think that something deeper down earlier is intrinsically representational,
That's
like a
right.
picture is, right?
Yeah.
But that's where we get into the trouble, is it not?
Well, indeed. So that is certainly right. The right question then is whether or not representations are, in the philosophical sense, real as
Yeah.
opposed to ideal. That is a matter of agent dealing, a matter of agent interpretation. Okay, and the dominant view is that representations at some level or other must be intrinsic somewhere. Okay, and you better look at the brain doing it then.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
that seems to me kind of just deeply mysterious how that could possibly be.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me a kind of superstition, really, to think that states
People
of the
say it, but it's hard to imagine what it could mean, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So here's a state which intrinsically represents, okay, some other state. Okay. Now, of course, one answer they will give is, well, how does it do it? How could it be? Well, they want to bring in your idea of resemblance there. Okay.
Right.
The state does look, the representing state does look, okay, in a very extended sense of look, okay,
Yeah,
like
very.
it's represented, that it shares the same structure. That's what we would call isomorphic with, okay, the state being represented. And this, in fact, is precisely the view that Wittgenstein developed in his first philosophy.
Right, but it's one thing. Wait, but it's one thing to say that the strings of characters in a sentence represent something, because you can look at their syntactic structure, right, and say, subject predicate matches in a certain way, thing and property, right? But how on earth would chemicals do that in your brain, right? How would they be structured to represent the fact that it's raining, or that your cat's on the mat, or...
I think you're right, but I think even saying that much might be a bit too much for Wittgenstein when we talk there about subject and predicate in that way. It kind of maps. That's still the thought that there's a natural mapping there.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Just as you said, that the picture just looks like. Okay. Well, in fact, he puts a lot of work into thinking about even the idea of how a picture looks like something.
Right.
So he has an example of, I do a stick man drawing with a hill and a man walking up it. Okay. And he says, well, how's this a picture of a man walking up a hill and not falling down one?
Right.
That is, that every picture also needs an interpretation.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not even that pictures, okay, represent, okay, absolutely objectively, independently of agents involved at some degree of interpretation. So I hope that makes it a little bit clearer.
Yes, I think very clear.
Is.
Yes.
So the thought is, it kind of lines up really. There's a kind of a brain, there's kind of a neurochemical state, okay, a high-level brain state, a mental state, something like a proposition, a sentence, in a natural language, and these all line up in one chain, okay, and represent, okay, how things are in the world.
Right.
Okay? Tends to go, by the way, at the top end of that kind of great chain of meaning. That the top is the thought that the best thing you can possibly have for representing the world is a scientific theory.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So that gives you the best possible kind of mathematical modeling of the world. It's the purest of pure representations of how the world is.
Right.
So it's interesting how this view kind of locks into a certain view about how science works and why science is important. Okay. Look, Wittgenstein wants to tell us that whole picture is deeply wrong.
So maybe now you can sort of talk through how that's supposed to go. What's fundamentally wrong with this? I mean, although I think we've seen glimpses just in our characterization of it, what's wrong with it, but maybe you could be more specific.
Well, certainly, I mean, one central thought for Wittgenstein is that this account is non-explanatory. Okay, that it really assumes what it's trying to explain. That is, it's trying to explain how meaning gets going. And again, he shows us how, in fact, you already assuming the existence of meaning in offering this explanation.
Right. So the obvious example of that is to say that something has meaning by way of convention. That clearly is unexplanatory, because the conventions are a bunch of conversations that people have, and so that needs to be explained. But I guess what then happens is that a person, what's ultimately non-explanatory about this is that at some point one simply is saying that the way we explain representation is by saying that some things are inherently representational, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's not obviously not
That's not
explanatory.
explanatory. It's also, like we said, a very non-naturalistic explanation, right? Because at some point we are just positing,
Yeah,
okay, as someone like Searle has to do in the end, okay,
yeah,
there just are these intrinsically representational states.
yeah.
Okay? So what we get then is the investigations in large part, okay, is a diagnosis and forensic examination of how we end up finding it natural to say things like that, okay, and getting ourselves into a real mess, okay, and we did get ourselves into a mess. I mean, at one point, when certain views about meaning were going about what you could do with a computer, and in parallel, certain views about the importance of language were going on, and a kind of behaviorist tradition. Okay, it seemed really very natural for people to say that that computers might one day think, but that dogs don't.
Right.
So okay, what kind of mess of different pictures here are crossing over
Yeah.
and clashing. Okay? So Wittgenstein offers us this long account then trying to trace through all the different sources of this set of ideas. Okay? Some of them arise from thinking about the nature of language. So one set of conceptions is, well, one set of worries, or one part of his diagnosis is that this conception of representations involves thinking of language as primarily being one kind of thing, being describing, okay, saying how things are in the world, that things are thus and so, okay, but putting describing as being what language is really about, and all the rest of the things that we do in language, okay, like commands and jokes and prayers and exhortations and all the stuff that we do in language, all the rich uses of language that we actually find in human life are kind of parasitic and peripheral on describing.
Right. So part, and especially in the early parts of the investigations, he's trying to disabuse us of this very simplistic representational view of
Okay?
language to show us that we do all
It's
sorts of things with it. Right.
all sorts of things, but
Yeah.
many of which don't involve or seem not to involve representation as such. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's one thing he wants to do. He also wants to show how this hooks up, this account of language and meaning hooks up to a particular notion of what the mind is. Okay, so on the picture that we have, language, as it were, is going on the outside. It's the outer, how we engage with others. But the real representational hard work is going on in the inside,
Right.
in our heads.
Right.
Okay, that's the thought. Okay, and so it involves this distinction between the inner and the outer, which of course he doesn't explicitly do this, but one can see it when it's certainly many of the things that he wants to say make it obvious that this is an idea that goes way back to Descartes.
Yeah.
Okay, this is
Absolutely.
really the Cartesian picture, okay, of the individual mind as being complete in itself, okay, and only afterwards, okay, engaging with the world.
Yeah. With less certainty, right? More certainty
Uh,
about the internal than about the external, right?
yeah. But
Yeah.
the epistemological issues will be a whole
Right.
separate area, but certainly that's right.
Right.
Okay? And so we also get going on an account of the notion of this inner privacy, the notion of the inner life, okay, and how we have a false picture of what that innerness consists in. Okay. These things come together, I think, the account of language and the account of mind, in the long set of remarks about what it is to follow a rule in the investigations. Okay. And that can often seem to someone new to Wittgenstein, new to philosophy, rather odd. Why is he so concerned with rule following? What's that about? Okay. And he talks about all different ways in which we might be follow a rule, and all different kinds of rules, from following a rule in chess, from following a rule like add two in arithmetic, okay, to following copying out a sentence,
Yeah.
okay, or reading a sentence is a kind of rule following, or even being guided by somebody in a dance, right? All sorts of apparently diverse phenomena. Okay, he asked us to look at through the lens of rule following. Okay, but what he's really using this for is we might say rule following is looks like a paradigmatic, but seems central to what it is to mean something. That if I'm to mean something by a word, okay, or by a phrase or expression or sentence, then I'm using it in some regular rule-governed way. Okay? And to put it in different terms, okay, we might say what we have here, rule following is the proxy for concept possession.
Right, right. So the idea is that rule following is at the heart of practices like languages, because wrapped up with the very idea of a concept is the idea of its correct and incorrect application, right? So what
Yeah,
constitutes a correct application of the concept and what constitutes an incorrect one?
yeah.
Um, and so rules are central to language. Otherwise, concepts wouldn't have any particular shape, and we couldn't speak
That's
to each
right.
other.
That's right.
Right.
So if I'm to use the word, the concept of dog, okay, then I have to apply the term dog consistently, okay, to a diverse set of phenomena. Dogs all, in fact, look very different from one
Yeah.
another. Okay, I have to apply it to all those different animals. Okay, and I can do so correctly or incorrectly. Okay, so it looks like there's only rule following if there is this normative background.
Right.
Okay? And moreover, we have to distinguish between following a rule, okay, and merely acting in accordance with a rule. Okay, I can give a nice example here. Okay, I once saw a study of how in the English game of cricket, okay, fielders are able to catch a ball. Right? How do they catch the ball? And some scientists analysed what they were doing, and saw them running at a certain rate and looking up at a certain angle and so forth. And they worked out that they were solving a quadratic equation, okay, of velocity and distance and so forth, okay. And they said that's how they're able to catch these balls, okay. And of course, Ian Botham was a famous cricketer at the time, who said, "Well, I failed O-level maths.
I have no idea what a quadratic
I have no
equation
idea
is.
what one of those is." Oh, that's not. Of course, you don't. Okay, but your brain knows how to do
Oh
it.
God,
That's what they said.
that's such a
The
Wittgenstein
distinction
a mistake,
between
right?
so the equation may correctly describe. It may be the rule which describes what they are doing. Okay, it doesn't follow from that they are necessarily following that rule.
That following that rule caused them to then perform correctly.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a true description of what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
So, no more than the fact that that objects obey the law of gravity. But they don't look around and see what's the law of gravity here. I'll do what it says. Okay? The law of gravity describes what they do.
But that's
So,
exactly how we commonly think about rule following. We think of it as we entertain these mental sentences that
yeah,
then, once we know what they are, then guide our future behavior
exactly.
as
That's
cause.
the thought.
So if rule following is at the heart of language, and that is our common conception of rule following, what is it that Wittgenstein is saying is wrong with that conception of rule following as a kind of an obedience to internal sentences that we rehearse to ourselves? What's wrong with the picture?
Well, first of all, it seems to involve a commitment to a picture that the real work is done internally.
Yes.
Okay. So that means that the possibility of my being correct or incorrect in my use of the rule is already there internally. If that were the case, it would mean that the essence of language is really an essentially private inner activity. Now we can go into what private means exactly here, but internal. I can do it without any reference to the idea of language as a shared activity, as a public activity. Okay, I can have my own internal criterion for distinguishing whether I'm using a term rightly or wrongly, and in famous and controversial sort of remarks, which are called the private language argument, but it's sometimes whether there is what kind of argument it exactly is sometimes hard to discern, and about which there's controversy. But Wittgenstein certainly wants to say that that isn't possible. Okay, but in a situation where we only have the quotes internal resources of an individual being to deal with. Okay, whatever seemed right to it would be right. Okay.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So it has because we're thinking of it precisely as something which is prior to language as a shared activity. Okay. We're thinking only of the mind, really in a Cartesian way.
As a private room, in a sense.
As a private room.
Yeah.
Okay? Isolated from the world. Indeed, isolated even from its own body.
Yes.
Just like
for Descartes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That in such a situation, if we envisage this impossible situation, the agent could not distinguish a correct from an incorrect use of a term.
Right. So let's just be very careful, just so not to confuse people. So the idea is something like this. It's, look, in order for this to be possible, it would have to be possible for us to privately, and that's in a sense purely internally, without any consideration of the outside, follow a rule. The difficulty is that we also have to admit that there's a difference between following a rule and thinking one is following a rule.
Yeah, yeah.
The difficulty is that a person in isolation in their own private room wouldn't be able to distinguish between thinking they're following a rule and following a rule, because from their perspective, anything could count as following the rule, because to a certain extent, what provides the constraint is not some private experience, but whether our performance is accepted in some public way.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's so the problem is that from a purely internal perspective, we can't distinguish between thinking we're doing something and actually doing it. Is that?
Yeah, that's pretty close to it, Dan. I think that's right. Okay, but remember, we're not here talking about the physical isolation of a normal human being.
No, we're talking about a kind of a.
We're thinking about a kind of Cartesian self. Okay, but that's really, you see, how we are thinking of ourselves in these models in representation. That's how we look to ourselves in these models. Okay, in which we don't even have the normal physical expressions of our ideas through bodily expression, for example. Okay, we're taking all of that out. Okay, so we're not talking about a Robinson Crusoe situation here, okay, but much more about how the mind is conceived, okay, in the philosophical tradition.
Right,
being something that could exist independently of everything else.
Right. No, the Robinson Crusoe is a very good example because, and I think it'll help maybe for people, because this is probably the hardest thing in Wittgenstein to sort of get. It's very slippery. The Robinson Crusoe example is great because Robinson Crusoe gets stranded, but of course he already has a language.
He already has a language.
And the language, and he's already, that had a public manifestation.
Yeah.
In order, the picture that the common picture, the representationalist picture that we're talking about, because it seeks to ground all public conventional activity on some internal process, right?
Yeah.
Has to ultimately take that internal process in conceptual isolation.
It's absolutely.
Right? Which Robinson Crusoe is not, right? He's not in conceptual isolation. He's only physically isolated because he fell off of a boat. What we have to imagine for the representational picture to be true is a kind of conceptual isolation. I think you're right to invoke Descartes, because that's exactly what he was talking about. And the problem there again is that it's unclear that it's not just that one could tell a correct from an incorrect use, but that it even makes sense to speak of a correct or an incorrect use.
It's not a question of not knowing that he could be right, but there would be no such distinction.
Right. In other words,
you're absolutely right. It's really important here to get the thought right. Okay, that representation is trying to explain things to ab initio right from the beginning, right at the foundation. And so Wittgenstein is now being absolutely ruthless in saying you're not going to be allowed anything, okay, outside of this picture you say you can make work.
Right.
Okay. And he again points out, no, you're making illegitimate recourse to this idea or to this thought or to this possibility. You're not allowed those. Okay, indeed. I mean, some of them are quite explicit. Dennett, for example, talks about this as methodological solipsism.
Yeah, yeah,
that's where it is. Okay, so Wittgenstein is trying to show that again and again, where we think we have something that will do that job, okay, that in fact it depends upon interpretation, it depends upon a context. Okay, in any case, there may not be one kind of it to begin with. So even, for example, we might think, what could be more basic, okay, than the act of pointing at something. Okay, kind of ostensive definition, just pointing at something. And even if I'm not allowed to physically point at it, then mentally point at it. Okay, even about that, Wittgenstein says, okay, this requires a certain kind of context to make sense.
Right. That's really important. I think the an example that the audience may find easier to digest is the example that Wittgenstein of adding two. Right. Yeah. So if you ask yourself, I start off 2, 4, 6, 8. Well, what should come next? And the natural answer that everybody's going to give is 10. And then you ask why. Right.
Yeah.
If you try to answer that by appealing to some purely conceptually isolated, internally grasped rule, there's no way to explain why the answer shouldn't be 12 or 14 or 16, because as a private mind, I could follow indefinitely many rules. I could follow the add 2 until you get to 10 rule, after which only add 6. I could be following part of what makes 10 the right answer. Is that other people accept it, right?
Right, and that's also a kind of a difficult point for people here, and that's where people can get very worried about Wittgenstein and why he is, in a certain way, quite subversive. Because you see, the attack here is on the whole idea of having some kind of ineluctable foundation for such things. Okay, whether it's a Platonic entity which is guaranteeing that the rule is add 2 right the way up to 10 billion and 2. Okay?
Right.
Or whatever it is, the thought that it's kind of anything would guarantee it, and even the thought, and here's why I have to kind of maybe press you a bit down when you talk about normativity here.
Yeah.
Even the thought that the practice, that is others, absolutely guarantee, okay, well, the rightness and wrongness is up for
no, it doesn't. Yeah,
it doesn't do that. Okay, it's just that we do go on in that way
for now, at least.
For now,
because practices do change. Practices change.
And when you grasp this thought, I mean, you ought to feel a little bit vertiginous. That is, you ought to feel a bit as if the ground's dropping away from your feet. Okay.
Yeah.
Relative to how the philosophical tradition conceived it before.
I think that's
because once you're there, you realize this is the only firm place to stand.
Yeah. I think that's partly because people often think of rules as providing guarantees of practices, when really all they do is describe practices, right? I mean,
indeed, exactly. So in the end, there will be only the practice, okay, and nothing is deeper than it, okay, and for that reason, this is an extraordinarily naturalistic picture, of human beings and human life, and indeed minded life, we might say, okay. There is nothing outside it guaranteeing that it's all going to carry on making sense. Okay, it's just that it goes on that way. We are animals of a certain kind. Okay, and our lives have the kind of shape appropriate to this kind of animal. Okay.
Yeah.
And we see, when we look at other species, okay, we don't think that there's something outside there guaranteeing that leonine life will go on making sense, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a book somewhere which says how lions are to behave in regard to one another, which they can check up on if they need to, or there's some kind of leonine Platonic heaven laying down rules of behavior for lions. It's very clear to us from the outside that it has the shape it has because of the history of the species and how they go on, their biological natures, okay? we offer a kind of ethological account of that animal in its environment.
Right.
My view is, and there are, by the way, Wittgensteinians who would very much disagree with me on this, but it would be the line that I would take, that we have an equally ethological view emerging from Wittgenstein about ourselves, okay, and about what seemed to be a magical, wondrous invention or intervention on the part of nature, the invention of language and meaning, and indeed reasons.
Yeah.
Okay. What looked like a kind of, if not given by God, then given by something equally miraculous, as it were, okay, is in fact has to be thought of as a natural phenomenon.
And something that everything that's alive does for the most part.
Yeah.
It's really so interesting. What you're describing is something that everyone thinks we need, but which everyone at the same time knows we don't have, right? In other words, it's funny that we think we need guarantees so much to
Yeah.
make sense of our practices, but at the same time, every person knows that that's not how practices are. I mean, look at sports, right? The rules evolve all the time. Now,
Yeah.
how would it be possible for rules to evolve on the traditional model of rule following that we were talking about? They would
Yeah.
have to be these unmovable sorts of ground of all of that
Yeah.
things like. So we're all familiar every day with the changing of rules and the way that rules change, right? And yet at the same time, I guess what's interesting to me is that this false picture that we hold is a false picture about something which at another level we know very well is not the case,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So let me give another analogy, which may help people. But so take money, right? So take coins and notes, right? So
Yeah,
we use these every day. Okay, we think they're very important. We're sorry if we lose them. We want to make lots of it. Okay, we have almost security around money. We value money, right?
yeah,
So we act as if money has the $5 or the £5 note has value, right? Okay. And we think, well, how does it have value? Hang on a minute, we think. This is weird. It's only a bit of paper. Right? How does that work? And so we reflect this. There must be something lying behind the money. Right?
right,
There's something that really has intrinsic value. Okay? And so it's the promise to pay the bearer on demand
right,
or whatever it is, or the gold in the bank. Okay?
right,
That's the real value. Okay? That's like saying words in language don't really have a meaning because there's arbitrary signs.
right.
The stuff over there
That's what has the real meaning.
guarantees it. That's
Right,
the real stuff.
right.
Okay. And then actually, when we go and look at the gold, right, we say,
Well, what makes it
oh,
valuable?
why is that valuable? That's only valuable because people want it. Right?
Right,
People will trade in it and use it. It's not intrinsically valuable.
right, right,
Intrinsically, some say it's beautiful. It's intrinsically has that nature, but it's not intrinsically valuable in itself, independently of our using it.
right,
But then you realize, hang on, if that's the case for gold, why didn't I just say that about the paper? And that is now the correct explanation.
right.
The paper has its value, okay, because we use it,
Because it's part of a practice.
because it's part of a practice.
But it's
So
not.
when Wittgenstein
Yeah,
says in a famous slogan, for the large variety of cases, when you think about meaning, think about the use. Okay, apply it to the money case. Okay, when you're thinking about how money has value, think about how it's used. Okay? That is, how it's traded, how we exchange it, how it lubricates social, business, and financial arrangements. Okay,
yeah,
it
yeah.
makes all that work. Okay, and if you think about how it is that someone might say it's weird because it doesn't have any intrinsic value, paper, it must be something else. Then you're really mirroring the same move that Wittgenstein's criticizing when we say it can't be just the words, right? The things we say, it must be that these things that we think in the bank of the mind,
Right,
okay,
right.
that's really doing the work.
That's a lovely analogy with the money.
Okay?
That's a really good one. I think everybody can understand that, right? And it also shows, that you can really miss everything in Wittgenstein if you try to sort of reduce him to these slogans. So, I mean, I think the slogan "meaning is use"
Oh
is
yeah,
the most common trivialization of Wittgenstein,
yeah,
and it's of course correct in one sense, but what it means, if you really understand it, is very vast and complex, and it pervades everything, all practices. It's not the way it seems trivial, right? I mean,
It's not that, you know, if I choose to use a word differently, then I can then it will mean something different.
right,
No,
right,
right?
right, right,
Okay,
right.
and it could still be the case that, you know, it might be a bad mistake for us to use, you know, hopefully adverbially as we do now. Okay, um, or to change the way we use that term. Okay, but I mean, if you just hang on to that kind of money analogy, think of all the different things that we do with money. Right? We don't
Yeah,
just do one thing with money either.
that's
Right?
right.
We do many different things with it. Okay, and they're engaged in all sorts of different activities. Okay? And in fact, what we have, okay, in the case of money, is not really even just one thing, but a variety of things which are grouped together under this kind of generic term money.
Right,
Okay,
right, right.
but they're all, what they have in common is they're all kinds of uses
Yeah, yeah,
of this stuff.
yeah. And I think that's really, just like you couldn't give a theory of money,
Yeah,
where by a theory you mean an account of what the thing is that is money. You
yeah,
could just describe a sprawling set of interconnected
yeah,
practices, all of which
yeah,
are the money practices.
yeah,
So it's a similar mistake to try and give a theory of the mind, right?
yeah.
Where the mind is
Well,
a thing that you then find a physical thing in the world that corresponds to. Instead, you're describing a whole bunch of
yeah,
practices that we engage in that we call
yeah.
talking, thinking, feeling, and so on and so forth.
That's right. About maybe in this analogy, at least, the money would be the kind of the language, okay,
Yeah,
and the mind is playing the role here of the kind of gold in the bank.
yeah,
Okay?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So when Wittgenstein wants to deny that there could be inner states which were intrinsically meaningful, this is analogous. Okay, and there will be disanalogies, but it's analogous to saying that the gold in the bank is
Valuable.
intrinsically valuable.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah, I really like that. All right, so let's in the just in our in our closing time, let's because I do want to have you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at the very end. But in terms of our last to sort of ease ourselves out of Wittgenstein, because I think really we gave as clear an account of it that you can give in this sort of format as can be given. So I don't want to even complicate it more. Um, where do you see, so let's now forget, let's forget for a minute that philosophy has been so ambivalent about Wittgenstein. Where could you see philosophy and other areas of inquiry going? What do you see as sort of Wittgenstein inspired uh, uh, new directions, either in philosophy or in the sciences?
Okay.
um, Maybe we could end with you talking about that, and then we'll talk
Yeah,
about
I
the
think
new
it's worth
direction.
saying that, you know, there is a perception of Wittgenstein as kind of anti-scientific. I don't think that's true at all. Okay? I think he's anti-scientistic. That is, he argues against conceptions of explanation, which mean that only scientific explanations count as explanations.
Right.
So that's what I do think he does is to clear a whole lot of philosophical confusions out the way so that we can get on with some of the straightforwardly empirical business of understanding ourselves and the world and our place in it. Okay, so there's a whole lot of developments going on in the cognitive sciences, for example, okay, which are now breaking away from that representationalist model. So these are the so-called E approaches. They stress our embodiment, okay, as opposed to our being kind of internal black boxes, representational engines. Okay?
Right.
They stress our place in the environment, okay. They stress that kind of ecological conception of ourselves in our world, the way that we're not that many of our um, thoughts only make sense in relation to being in a world.
Right.
Okay? They stress what's called our inactive aspect. It's a slightly strange word, but it means that many of the cognitive processes that we engage in are happening, as it were, in real time, okay, actively engaged with the world, so that the system that's doing the what cognitive scientists think of as processing, okay, I don't like the word much, but that's what they think of it, is both the agent and the world together as a single system. Okay? Interestingly, the best sort of empirical support for that kind of view, which I think comes from a certain reading of Wittgenstein, is one that stresses our haptic senses, that is touch, okay, and ability to handle things, our sense of the gravity of the center of gravity when we pick up an object and so forth. Okay?
Right.
The representationalist model had great success, it must be said, in thinking about the visual for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Okay? But it left the haptic touch to one side. So there's a whole lot of developments going on in the cognitive sciences which are breaking away from the representationalist model and which are influencing people working in AI and what we mean by that now, and robotics and so forth. So, for example, I think it's pretty standard now for people in AI to say that you're not going to get any kind of interesting artificial intelligence if it hasn't got, you know, a body or something that counts a bit like a body in
Right.
which it's engaged and reacting to and responding to a real world. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
The idea that you could have just a kind of virtual intelligence.
A mind in a box, literally, right?
It's a view still held by some, it's mostly held by the physicists, actually, okay?
Which is weird,
oddly enough. But they have other ideological commitments. For people often now working in robotics, okay, the idea of embodied cognition, okay, is looking like the way forward, okay? And that's certainly something that, even if they don't realize it themselves, it comes out of Wittgenstein. Okay?
Right.
In other areas, one sees work going on, for example, interesting work going on memory. Okay, so for a long time, a very long time, we've had a model of memory as a kind of archival process. Okay, in which stimuli comes in, and the representation, as it were, is put in a drawer somewhere.
Right.
The kind of indexing system, and then we kind of pull it out. Okay, and so there's long been a search for, you know, the engram, which is the kind of the drawer basically in which to put these things. And well, it depends who you talk to a bit about this, but certainly there are some eminent scientists working on memory that I've come across who say that we've just had to abandon that way of thinking because it just doesn't work. So we think of memory in a much more complicated kind of way. First of all, there's not been one kind of phenomenon. That's pretty important. Okay, making that Wittgensteinian move of saying, actually, we've got a lot of diverse phenomena.
Yeah.
They're connected up, but it isn't just one thing. So the very first thing we did, which is to say something like, "Well, what's memory then?" was already a mistake.
Yeah.
We already committed ourselves to a certain view of things.
And the correction has been very much a Wittgensteinian type of correction. Yeah.
So we look at memory in its context, the idea of distributed memory, social memory, and so forth. Okay, so that there's a whole area going on there. Okay, I'm interested in animal cognition. Okay?
Maybe talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So. And that's an area where all sorts of pictures and misleading pictures cross over, okay, about language, about meaning, about behavior, about mind, okay. A whole lot of pictures cross over, including issues about what we can know about another mind, right? So one of the outcomes of that Cartesian picture, okay, was that it becomes problematic for me to know what you are thinking.
Or if you're thinking at all.
Or if you're thinking at all.
Right.
And so, of course, in your case, then I'm supposed to rely upon the fact that I can understand what you're saying, okay, and that it gives me ideas. Okay. Of course, in the case of other animals, non-linguistic animals, I can't make that move.
Right.
And so it looks like what looks like a kind of academic, kind of purely philosophical, skeptical problem in philosophy. On this side of the species barrier, on our side, looks like a real world issue. Okay, when the ethologist is out in the field looking at the bonobo monkeys or something. Okay,
Right.
right. So or looking at apes or orangutans or indeed at dolphins. Okay, and so so many of these problems kind of clash and meet. That's why it's an interesting area. It's a real mashup of philosophical problems. Okay, I think that's an area that's really rife for, really ready for Wittgensteinian kind of therapy to say, hang on, let's tease these problems out now and lay that one out. Here's a real tangle. Oh, hang on. If we untangle this, we see it's actually really much more straightforward here. Okay?
Yeah.
And so some of my work is engaged in trying to get at the foundations and diagnose why things have gone wrong in this area. Why we get a kind of disjunct between, even still today, some animal scientists, they're a minority more these days, saying I can never know I can never make a claim that involves thinking about an animal having other psychological states at all.
Right.
Be careful of the term psychological states, but thinking about the mindedness of other animals at all. So trying to kind of get that claim out the way, so we can get on with the empirical business of actually investigating how other animals work and think and live. Okay, people are using these ideas. So someone like Michael Tomasello, who's one of the leading researchers on primates. His book on how language, book on the evolution of human language, which uses primates as the empirical base. Every chapter begins with a quotation from Wittgenstein. Okay, which he makes use of. Okay, and he's trying to show how meaning gets going there in forms of interaction and forms of cooperation, forms of practice, in other words, that go on in those simian communities. So the idea of a simian practice, or indeed of a leonine practice, conceived of as a kind of ethological phenomenon, I think is a great value to the animal sciences, and that's the area which I want to work.
Let me ask you a question just very quickly about this, because it's so interesting. Sort of ask you a Wittgensteinian question about the disconnect between how we think of other people and how we think of other animals.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's because we share practices with other people that it's so easy for us to ascribe to them thoughts, feelings, and so on and so forth. In other words, I think that we have a mistaken conception of why we are reluctant to ascribe those things to animals. Exactly. It's not because we have something inside that they miss. Yeah. It's because we're not engaged in practices with them. We're looking at them from the outside. If we were engaged with practices with them, we wouldn't think of them any differently. And one of the ways that you can tell that is when we interact with other people, when we see someone else writhing in pain and we go over and help them, it's not as if we first verify that there really is an internal state going on, right?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, because we're already engaged in caring practices with these people, we do these things, right? And I think that it's very nice the way you put that in. I see now how animals really could be helpful to clearing up these problems because they almost provide almost like a control, right? They almost provide a kind of a
But Wittgenstein's very interesting here because he's on a kind of line. He looks both ways. So at one point he says about dogs, for example, that a dog can hope to go for a walk, but it can't hope to go for a walk tomorrow, or something similar, right? So and that leads some people to say, oh, there you are. You see, it's because the dog doesn't have language that it can only have these very simple thoughts, right?
Yeah.
Okay. If that notion about real hope only gets going when I can use the term hope correctly. Okay, so then I know it's wrong to say things like I hope that this will happen yesterday.
Okay? Yeah.
Okay, so some people wanted to take Wittgenstein's thought that way, and that rather supports an existing view that there's a massive difference between linguistic animals like us and the rest of non-linguistic nature. But look, Wittgenstein also says this. He says, if you want to know what intention is, okay, well, look at a cat stalking, right? And here we see that intention is not, okay, a human-only phenomenon. It's also the case that I can't intend to do something yesterday, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It also has normative command, but still we can use the term intention because we see it in lived animal life.
Yeah.
Okay? It's a concept that's common. Okay, not that the cat has the concept. We have a concept of intention. Okay,
Yeah.
but we aren't obliged from not applying that notion or using that notion in relation to animals.
Right.
Not because we have a view about what's going on in its head. Okay, but because of what we see the animal doing. And this has been an important lesson, I think, in the ethological sciences. The realization that when you're dealing with the animal just in the lab, right, you've no chance of getting that kind of shared practice going, those shared interactions going. You need to be out there in the field, okay, to get that sense of how meaning gets going in the animal's life.
Yeah.
So that's why people like, Jane Goodall and the field ethologists, a long tradition of that now, okay, have worked in this incredibly painstaking way. It takes years and years, okay, of close observation, very carefully documented, producing ethograms, that is, studies of how the animal behaves, okay, what its interactions are, slowly building up empirically, okay, a picture of the shape and structure of the animal's life, and it's in that picture that you then see meaning arising. What you are doing next, just finish, is to say, oh, I wonder what's going on in the animal's head. Right? When you do the real empirical work, that philosophical puzzlement goes away,
Right.
because you can see it.
Yeah, and I would argue that the reason why it's not, I think people might get a mistaken picture of this. The reason why it takes so long isn't just because the animals have to be comfortable enough with you around to let you look at them in detail. It's because, to a sense, you have to share their life with them in order to understand it.
Exactly.
And that's true of other people. I mean, one of the things that was so great, and I think in your paper, which, like I said, will be linked, is your point. At one point you're talking about how, we almost talk about not understanding. We conflate the idea of not understanding with the common idea of not speaking a foreign language, right?
Yeah.
And in other words, this idea is supposed to be, the private is private in the sense that, in a very different sense of me not sharing your language. It's and what you say is, no, actually, it's not different, right? I mean, you're no less alienated from somebody when you can't talk to them than you would be if you were in a private room away from them, right? In other words, it's a mistake to make these distinctions. And I think we would almost be as hard pressed to understand the behavior of another group of people whom we didn't live with, as a bunch of animals that we didn't live with, right?
Exactly. If we take that thought and apply it to think about in the human case especially, and if we take that view of how we get along together, this has enormous implications now for ethics, right?
Yeah.
And how we think about moral philosophy. Okay, that is, are the duties that I owe you, and is the way that I should behave in regard to you, is that founded on some internal set of facts about what you are, right? That you're the possessor of certain capacities. Okay. And is that what really underlies ethics? Or is it that, no, this stuff goes on underneath, that relation goes on first of all, and those capacities we describe are kind of afterthoughts, really.
Yeah.
So there's a different kind of view here about ethics that will emerge. There's nothing directly in Wittgenstein that one could point to here, but this is stuff that one could kind of pull out of his ideas that make us think. And after all, what's really important here, despite the view that some people have, the Wittgensteinians form some kind of quasi-religious cult, okay, who are constantly regurgitating the same ideas. Wittgenstein wanted us to learn to shift for ourselves, he says, to think for ourselves, okay, and to take some of these ideas and some of these approaches and apply them to the problems that concern us now, okay. But I would hope, and it seems to me one of the things lacking in contemporary philosophy, with the same kind of virtues, that is, this ruthless honesty and immense self-criticism. Okay?
Yeah.
Taking philosophy kind of seriously, not in the sense of being some kind of highbrow game of chess that we should be playing, okay, but because these things link up to absolutely fundamental and deep things in
Yeah.
our life and the way that our culture thinks about itself and so on.
Yeah, I don't I the hopeful sort of new directions that you're seeing science go in some of the areas of science at least, I don't yet see happening yet in philosophy. I'm almost wondering whether philosophy is going to have to experience some sort of a substantial crisis before it and the current crisis in the university may very well bring it about. Philosophy departments are among the most vulnerable in the current climate because of their perceived inapplicability. And I wouldn't be surprised if things have to sort of get worse for us before we start maybe exploring some more unconventional directions, like Wittgenstein hoped we would. Let's just finish in the last minute or two. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you're doing? I know you've got an edited book coming out. I know that you've got, I believe, another chapter in a book coming out. You're doing work with the society. Give us a little quick run through of what you're working on right
Sure.
now.
Yeah. So I've got coming up with Bloomsbury, a second edition, which I'm co-editing, called Portraits of Wittgenstein. And that's a second edition with quite a lot of new pieces on all the kind of personal memoirs of people who met Wittgenstein. So this is quite separate from the philosophies. Separately from that, he is, of course, it's linked, but independently of that, he's also a fascinating character, okay, who, if anyone wants to understand the 20th century, he's a fascinating kind of lens to look at that century through. Um, and we've put together about 80 or 85, I think, separate memoirs of.
Oh wow, that's a lot.
It's a huge 2-volume work. The original first edition was 4 volumes. We haven't lost things, but we've managed to get into 2 volumes. Even we've added some rather new pieces and unfamiliar pieces, and not so well-known pieces, including one which I'm pleased to have about Wittgenstein's time here in Newcastle, which is a nice piece to have. So that's coming out with Bloomsbury. Okay, so I hope that'll be welcome. I've also just recently come back from overseeing in Cambridge, overseeing the restoration of Wittgenstein's grave, which would have perhaps you might think in a rather symbolic way. The legistone there got into quite a mess, okay, and was rather worn, letters becoming illegible. With the permission of the family, we've now managed to restore that to a much more interesting condition, a better condition. Interestingly, of all the graves in that famous graveyard outside Cambridge, it's the most visited.
It is.
People always, the one they come to see there, and there are lots of other well-known intellectuals in that Ascension Parish Church and burial ground outside Cambridge. Is Wittgenstein almost wholly who they come to see. That's very interesting remark about the kind of cultural resonance of Wittgenstein. So there are 2 projects to do with Wittgenstein the man. In my own work and research work, I've just published a paper which is called Minding Animals, which is in a collection of papers about the work of Mary Midgley, the philosopher Mary Midgley, and someone who taught me as an undergraduate. Has been a lifelong friend, and so we produced a kind of festschrift for her, and that'll be a very interesting volume. And that's a piece really about trends in thinking about animals. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm giving a paper on the idea of what is of animals, what's manifested behavior at the Kirchberg International Conference in 2 weeks. So I'll be going off to just outside Vienna to give that paper. And I'm thinking about writing a book on Wittgenstein for Bloomsbury. They've asked me to do that. I'm considering it, okay, because there are a lot of books on Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
By some really great people, excellent books, okay, and I'm only going to write one if I can find my own kind of voice
Right. You
in
don't want to add to a core, like to a to a.
I just do the same thing again. I don't see that necessary, but I'm much more interested in the question of what we do with Wittgenstein's ideas,
Yeah.
rather than arguing, sort of going over the interpretive questions again.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so something along the lines, maybe as we've been talking this afternoon about that. Okay, um, so I'm considering doing that. I'm closely involved with the work of the British Wittgenstein Society. We have about 600 or so members, worldwide. Okay,
We'll,
and
we'll provide a link to the
yeah,
society's webpage.
and we put on a conference every year, and we have lectures and so forth, and reviews. And so please look at our website. Um, um, People with an interest in Wittgenstein can join the society. It's free.
You don't have to be a English to join.
No. The society that's British, not the members necessarily. It's a worldwide organisation. And one of the things that the reason why I'm interested in work for that society is because it has a very outward looking view. Okay, so we're not interested primarily, as some people are, in exactly how many Wittgensteins were there and when did he say what and how do we
Yeah.
do that? We understand this remark. We're interested in getting these ideas out there. We think these ideas, as I've tried to explain, are desperately needed in our contemporary world. Okay, that they are at the very least, uh, an urgent correction.
Yeah.
The way we're currently thinking. Okay, and I believe provide a foundation for much more fruitful investigations, both philosophical and empirical,
Yeah.
in the future. So society is not a kind of strange cult. Okay, it's very much outward looking and wanting to engage with other ideas, other thinkers.
Well, it sounds like you're a busy man. um, I want to thank you so much for doing this, Ian. I greatly appreciate it, and I enjoyed it very much. And we're going to link to as many of the things you talked about as possible in the link section. And I wish you the best of luck in all these very interesting sounding endeavors.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about these things.
Great seeing you again, Ian. All
You
right.
too.
Talk to you
Bye.
soon. Bye bye.